I've worked my way until it's time to divide for the neck. But before I do, I want to show you some tricks. So here's your average binding off in the middle of the row neckline. And you can see you have three distinct problems. You have this gap that happens right here whenever you bind off in the middle of the row. And you have the dip. And of course that comes from the fact that these stitches are not holding hands with anyone else. And all of a sudden they're whoop, like a little kid got off the teeter-totter and the other kid whoa, falls off. Okay. You also have this gap because this column of stitches is unconnected with this column of stitches. So you have the gap and the dip. Then over here you have the hole. And that comes from that Bart Simpson chokehold of that final bound off stitch that is wrapped around the throat of this column of stitches. And it also interrupts the flow of that column like with a purl bump. So you have the gap, the dip, and the hole. This is from my video, Patty's Knitting Bag of Tricks. Isn't that so much nicer? No gap. Those columns of stitches are locked together. No dip. And then over here, no hole. And you have an uninterrupted column of stitches. So I think, given the choice between these two, I would rather have that. Because even though we're going to pick up stitches later, sometimes you can still see that gap in that hole. So the first thing we're going to do is deal with connecting this column of stitches with this column of stitches. And we're going to do it with what's called the left lifted increase. Now I do have a free YouTube video just on the left lifted increase. So you can look at that really up close and personal with chunkier yarn. But it's worked into the purl bump of the stitch, not one row below, but 2 rows below. Now, you might see instructions telling you to turn your work around and pick up the purl bump of the row 2 rows below, but that's such a futzy way to do it. So I'm going to give you 2 easier ways to grab that purl bump. One is take the tip of your left needle and insert it back to front directly in the middle of the stitch 2 rows below, and then just back up the tip of that needle right through the stitch 1 row below, and you've grabbed the purl bump. So I'll do that again. Just go back to front directly through the heart of that stitch and go ahead and back up, and there's that purl bump. And it looks like a stitch with 2 legs on your needle, with the leading leg being in the back. The other way to grab it is just put your needle directly in front of the running bar and just move it straight forward to pick up the leg of that stitch 2 rows below and back up. And of course the leg of the stitch is connected to the purl bump. So there you have it. Do that one again. Just going to put my needle directly in front of the running thread and just move forward directly in to that leg of that stitch and lift. Okay, once you have that purl bump on your needle, go ahead and knit it through its leading leg, which is the back loop. And it doesn't matter, of course, whether you pick or you throw, doesn't matter. Just go ahead and knit that stitch. And that is called the left lifted increase. Now, it's there to lock these 2 columns of stitches together, but now we have to get rid of it. We've added a stitch, we have to get rid of it. So I'm going to go ahead and knit 1 stitch and pass that extra stitch that we made over. So I've made a stitch, I've gotten rid of it. And that whole function is just to lock these 2 columns of stitches together. Now again, if you're new to knitting, this is extra credit fun. You could easily just join a new ball and bind off the center. Okay, now I'm going to take that off and do this again, but this time I'm going to add the new ball of yarn because I still haven't added my new ball. Okay, so there I am back where I started. So I've worked my way, whoops, got to take that guy out. There's my increase. Okay, so I've worked for my size 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 31. Okay, just double checking. I've worked my way 31 stitches, and I need to bind off the center 15. So again, I'm going to pick up that purl bump. This is extra credit. You could simply join a new ball and bind off the center 15. But I just want to show you what that looks like and why we know that that could be a problem. So if I simply joined a new ball and I started to bind off, there I'm knitting 1 stitch, I'm knitting 2 stitches, I pass over, I've bound off 1. I knit, I pass over, I've bound off 2. Okay, let's just pause for a second. There you can see what I'm talking about. There's that gap and there's that dip where the stitches dip down. So it's not the end of the world. This is extra credit for you more advanced knitters. If you want to join a second ball of yarn and just bind off, it's totally not the end of the world. This is really a refinement. So here we go. I'm going to start by picking up that purl bump 2 rows below. There it is on my needle. And now I'm going to enter to knit it, but this time I am going to join a new ball to knit that. And I'm just going to fold the yarn over with the tail on the bottom, loop that over the needle, and knit 1 stitch. Now I've gotten, whoops, just split that yarn a little bit. Okay, now I've added a stitch, I have to get rid of it. So I would knit the next stitch, and I would pass over that extra stitch I just created. Now notice it's all loosey-goosey because I had joined a new ball. I give a little snug to that tail and all is right with the world. Now I'm ready to begin my bind off. But remember, you've already knit 1 stitch. So don't start by knitting 2 and passing over. You've already knit 1 stitch. So when you bind off, it starts with knitting 2 stitches. So I've already knit 1, and now I just have to knit a second, pass over. Now I've bound off 1 stitch. So again, you're going to work up to the point that you need to bind off. You're going to do a left lifted increase, joining the new ball. You have added a new stitch, so now you have to knit 1 and pass over to get rid of it. Then you begin your bind off with knit 1, pass over. And I'm going to continue. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I bind off 2. I bind off 3. I never count them till I do them. 4. There's 7. And there's 14 and 15. So let's just pause for a second and take a look. I'm just going to transfer this stitch over to this needle so we can pause for a second. So there's that tail of the new yarn, and I'm going to snug that up. And you're going to see how later we can weave this tail in and really join this together. But if I hang on to that tail, you can see that there is no gap, there is no dip. It's locked those 2 columns of stitches together. Now the one thing that I want to alert you to always, don't forget, if I counted and I saw 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, and think I screwed up, no I didn't, remember, there's that last stitch. However, that doesn't solve our problem of that hole. So instead of binding off the 15th stitch, so I'm going to undo this, we're going to get rid of it a different way. So at the beginning, you've worked your way to the point where you're going to bind off. You do a left lifted increase, you knit 1 stitch, get rid of the increase, then you begin your bind off. Knit 1, pass over, knit 1, pass over. And you're going to bind off 1 fewer stitches. And instead of ending with the final bind off, I'm going to end with a knit 2 together. So I'm going to put that stitch back where it came from, back over here onto the left needle, and I'm going to end by working a knit 2 together. And then I'm going to continue across the way. And again, it does not matter whether you pick or throw. So let me go back to picking. And let's take a look at what that gives us. And then I'm going to continue with the next series of bind offs so we can look at the sloped bind off. And you'll look at what a lovely neckline that will make. But before I do that, let me just work my way to the end of the row and then we'll take a look. So I've gotten rid of the first 3 issues. I've gotten rid of the gap, the dip, and the hole. And now we're going to smooth out the rest of the bind offs. But let's just pause for a second. I'm going to pull it down to the cable and we'll take a look. And you can see already how much nicer that is. There's no hole there because we replaced the final bind off with a knit 2 together. There's no gap here because we've locked those 2 columns of stitches together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and purl all the way across and then we'll take a look at what we do next. So I've purled my way across, but I am going to stop 1 stitch shy, and this is getting me ready for the next bind off. And instead, I'm just going to leave it unworked. Just slip it over there to that needle for now. And I'm done with that ball of yarn. Okay, now I come back over here, and it's time for my 4-stitch bind off on this side. Now, because I have joined a new ball, I can't do my little sloped bind off trick on this one, but that's okay. I'm going to show it to you on the next one. Just do a little yarn management here. I normally knit and purl backwards, so I never have this yarn management issue, but I'm working normally for this video. But maybe for the next one I'll work backwards, so I'll show you what I mean by not having yarn management issues. So I'm going to begin my bind off, and I have a 4-stitch bind off over on this side. So I pass over 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that first one's always going to be really loosey-goosey, so don't forget you have that tail. Just give it a little snug. You'll be fine. Whoops, lost my needle. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to purl my way to the end. And I'm actually going to pause for a second. I'm going to turn around and purl my way. And you can see why I get less yarn management issues, because 1 ball of yarn stays on one side, 1 ball of yarn stays on the other side because I knit and purl backwards normally. Okay, so this is me completing the row, purling. And then we're going to take a look at the next series of bind offs. So I have to bind off 4 stitches on the other side of the neck, and then I'll have a 3-stitch bind off on each side. So for the sloped bind off, I am not going to work the last stitch in the row before the bind off. So here I am, I'm ready to turn my way back around to the right side. Of course, I don't have to turn around because I'm right now purling backwards. And voila, I'm on the right side row. Okay, so here we go. On the right side, I'm going to work my way to that neck edge. Except when I get all the way to the last stitch, I am in fact not going to knit it. So I'm going to get my way to that last stitch, And I'm not going to work it at all. And you're going to see why later. I'm just going to slip it. And this is just smooth out that bind off. I also have a video on the sloped bind off, which I'll link to, just in case you want to sort of watch it separately for the shoulders, so you can get a sense of what's going on without having to worry about two balls at once. So there I am, I'm to the end, I'm just going to slip that. So now, back on the other side, I need to do my 4-stitch bind off at the neck. And if we remember, there's that last stitch unworked. Remember from the previous row. So I'm going to put it on my right needle. I'm going to slip the first stitch on the left needle onto the right needle, and I'm going to pass that unworked stitch over, and that's bind off 1. And then I'm going to continue. Bind off 2, bind off 3, and bind off 4. And what it does, just going to pause for a second to show you, is it smooths out that bind off. Instead of that stair-step bind off that you normally get, you're going to get a much smoother edge. It's going to look much nicer when you pick up stitches. So we're going to look at it one more time, and this time I'm going to work my way backwards, because now I have to do my 3-stitch bind off on the other side. But before I can do that, I need to purl back on this side, because of course we're working both sides at once. This time I'm going to do it backwards, and you're going to see why when you're working 2 sides at once, yarn management is so much nicer when you know how to knit and purl backwards. I teach that in the Craftsy class, Improve Your Knitting, Alternative Methods and Styles. And I'm going to have my website set up, hopefully really soon, with a online store, so you can order the DVD and you can own it forever, 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 and not have to worry about it ever going away or anything happening with streaming. It's just yours. Okay, so remember, for the sloped bind off, the row before, I'm going to work up to the last stitch, but then I'm not going to work that last stitch. So here I am, up to the last stitch, but instead of working this stitch, I'll just pop it back on the needle. And here I am, I'll just do it normal for a second. So remember, I was purling. So there's that last stitch on this neck edge that I haven't worked. So I slip that from the left needle to the right needle, slip the next stitch from the left needle to the right needle, pass 1 stitch over, and that counts as my 1-stitch bind off. And there's 2, and there's 3, and I'll show you what this looks like. Sorry, my computer just went to sleep. I'll show you what this looks like backwards for the 4th one, just in case you are interested in knitting and purling backwards. So if I'm binding off this one, there it is. Just pass that guy over. And that has smoothed out that edge. Oops, wait, sorry, that was supposed to be 3. I did one too many. Abort, abort. Supposed to bind off 4 and then bind off 3. Okay. So there you go. You get the general idea here. I'm just going to pause for a second and show you what this looks like. And then I'll complete it on my own time, because it's getting really hot in my office and it's dinner time. So to sum up, A, do not worry about this extra credit trick if you're just dealing with working 2 balls of yarn at the same time for the first time. That's enough to handle. So no problem in just doing the pattern as written, knitting your way to the center, 15, joining a new ball, binding off 15 stitches, or however many for your size, and then doing your neck bind offs. This is purely extra credit. I'm just going to pause for 1 second here. So if you're doing the extra credit, fancy schmancy, to sum up, what we did was we worked to one stitch. We worked up to the point where we were going to divide for the neck. Then we did our left lifted increase here. That locks those two columns of stitches together. Then I added a stitch, I have to get rid of one. So knit one, pass the new stitch over. Then begin your bind off. Knit one, pass over, knit one, pass over, into one stitch before the end. And you're going to end with that knit two together. The sloped bind off works, smoothing that rounded neckline out. The row before, when you get to that last stitch, don't work it. Just slip it. Then when you're coming back at the beginning of the row, ready to do a bind off, say it's time for me to bind off 4 stitches, I slip that unworked stitch from the left needle to the right needle. Slip the next stitch from the left needle to the right needle, pass unworked stitch over, and that's one stitch bound off. So that's just a nice way to smooth out that neck. I still have one more bind off to do over here, which I'm going to do, and then I'll go into my decreases, and I'll just come back and show you what it looks like after I finish and work a few decreases. And I'll even show you how, if you really want to make it look beautiful before you pick up the stitches, you can use that tail to lock those two ends together.